The wind had been cruel all day, dragging dust through the bone-colored hills, rattling the shutters on Eli Calder's ranch house like a restless spirit that could not find its grave. The sky was the color of pewter and grief. Evening came early that winter, bleeding into the plains before he could finish chopping wood. By the time he stacked the last log, the snow had begun its slow descent, quiet as breath over a coffin. He lit the lamp in the window, the same way he had every night for 5 years. Habit, not hope. No one came this way anymore. Not since the war took his neighbors, not since the fever took his wife and their little boy. The ranch had grown still, stripped of laughter, filled instead with the rhythm of things that didn't talk back, wind, cattle, and the creak of a rocking chair before the hearth. He was pouring himself a tin cup of coffee when he saw her. At first, she was nothing more than a shadow against the falling white, a figure staggering through the gate, clutching her shawl tight, barefoot, moving as if she'd walked through miles of frost and memory just to reach him. He set down the cup, the bitterness cooling on his tongue. The dogs didn't bark. They only lifted their heads, sensing something beyond threat, the scent of desperation. By the time he reached the porch, she had fallen to her knees in the snow. Her lips moved soundlessly, eyes wild and glassy. He knelt beside her, the air around her trembling with the cold of death. "Easy," he muttered, though he wasn't sure she could hear. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, a sack of bones and willpower wrapped in torn calico. Inside, the fire was the only light. He laid her near it, stripped the wet cloth from her shoulders, and covered her with a wool blanket. Her skin was so pale he thought for a moment she'd already gone. But then her chest rose, slow and stubborn. He crouched beside her, studying the cracked lips that tried to form words. "Let me stay," she whispered. "I'll be your wife." The words hung in the room like smoke, soft, absurd, sacred. Eli's jaw tightened. He had not heard the word wife spoken aloud since the fever took his own. It was a ghost of a word, echoing through the hollow he'd built around himself. He said nothing. He only stirred the fire, watching the light stretch across her face. Her eyes had closed again and her breathing deepened. When he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, he saw the dirt beneath her nails, the small cuts on her feet. The trail of someone who had come farther than sense allowed. He left her there by the fire and poured another cup of coffee. The night pressed close to the windows, howling through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the snow thickened, a curtain drawn between them and the rest of the world. When dawn came, it brought silence and the faint smell of thawing pine. Eli found her awake, sitting upright beneath the blanket, her hair tangled and damp. She looked around as though she didn't believe the place was real. "You're at the Calder place," he said, setting a bowl of stew near her. "Closest town's a day's ride." "You came through the storm." She took the spoon but didn't eat right away. "How long was I asleep?" "Half a night." Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. She ate slowly, the motion small and careful, like a woman who had forgotten how to deserve food. After a while, she spoke again. "My name's Clara Vale." Eli nodded. "You came from up north?" Her eyes flickered. "From what's left of it." He didn't ask more. He'd heard whispers through the few riders who passed his way, talk of a settlement burned down by raiders, of women turned out with nothing but what they could carry. Whether that was her story or not, it didn't matter now. The land had a way of burning everything clean, one way or another. When she finished eating, she looked toward the window, where snow drifted against the glass. "You live out here alone?" "I do. Your wife," she began, then stopped. "Gone," he said simply. The word was a stone he'd carried too long to feel its weight anymore. Clara lowered her gaze. Around her neck hung a thin leather cord, and from it, a silver ring glinted faintly in the light. She touched it once, gently, as though it burned. He noticed, but said nothing. Days passed. She slept in the spare room and spoke little. She washed the dishes, mended a torn shirt, swept the hearth. Every sound she made was small and careful, as if she feared her presence might break something invisible between them. Eli worked outside, fixing the gate, checking the cattle, keeping busy with the kind of silence that had become a shield. At night, the house breathed again, 2 sets of footsteps instead of 1. Sometimes, through the thin wall, he heard her stir in her sleep, whispering names he didn't know. Once he heard her sob, soft, strangled, quickly silenced. He sat by the fire, staring into the coals, wondering what kind of woman walked barefoot through snow just to offer herself to a stranger. By the end of the week, the storm had sealed the road east. They were trapped by the season, 2 ghosts bound by circumstance. She asked once if she should leave when the thaw came. He said, "We'll see." But that night, as the wind clawed at the roof and the firelight swayed across her sleeping face, Eli Calder felt something he hadn't in years. Not love. Not yet, but the faint stir of time moving again. A reminder that loneliness was not life, only its echo. And so he kept the lamp burning in the window, this time not out of habit, but in quiet defiance of the dark. Winter did not loosen its grip quickly. The storm faded, but the cold lingered. The kind that turned breath to smoke and silence to something heavy enough to hear. Days began and ended in the same gray light, yet the house, once hollow as a grave, had changed. There was movement now, the quiet rhythm of hands that mended, scrubbed, and arranged things not for comfort, but for survival. Clara Vale recovered slowly. She wrapped her bruised feet in cloth and worked barefoot by the hearth, washing linen with the precision of someone who needed order to keep from breaking. She spoke little. The words she did use were soft, practical. "Water's boiled, wood's low. I'll mend that sleeve." Eli let her be. He had learned long ago that silence was its own language, and sometimes the kindest thing a man could do was not fill it. In the mornings, he found the kitchen warm and coffee waiting, though she never drank it herself. At midday she followed him to the fence line, handing nails or holding boards while he hammered them into place. At dusk, they ate by firelight, neither saying much, their movements slow and deliberate, 2 souls who had known too much of loss to need explaining. Still, she never smiled. When he caught her reflection in the window, she looked less like a guest and more like someone standing halfway between staying and vanishing. At night, he sometimes woke to the sound of her crying. Not loud, just the trembling of breath swallowed before it reached a sob. Once he heard her murmur a man's name. It wasn't his, and he didn't expect it to be. The world beyond their valley remained distant until a rider came. It was early afternoon when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Eli stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as a dusted figure reined in by the porch. The man's horse steamed with exhaustion, flakes of snow clinging to its mane. "Afternoon, Calder," the rider said, tipping his hat. "Came up from Dry Creek. There's talk down there. A fire hit the northern settlement hard. Few made it out. Raiders by the look of it. They've been pushing south." Eli's eyes flickered toward the window where he saw Clara's faint outline behind the curtain. Her stillness was sharper than any gasp. "Any names?" he asked. The rider shook his head. "No one keeps records in ashes." He shifted in the saddle. "Just thought you'd want to know. Folks are banding together near the river, what's left of them." Eli nodded once. "Appreciate it." The rider tipped his hat again, spurred his horse, and vanished into the white horizon. When Eli stepped back inside, Clara was standing near the stove, her hands clutching the edge of the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes burned with recognition. "It was them," she whispered. He didn't ask who. The truth was there already, hanging between them like smoke from an unseen fire. "My husband." She stopped, forcing breath between her teeth. He tried to fight. There were too many. They took the women first, then burned what they couldn't use. When I escaped, the others called it cowardice. Said I ran while their men burned. Eli stood silent, his rough hands resting on the back of a chair. Outside, the snow fell in heavy flakes, softening the world to nothing but white and memory. "You walked from there," he said finally. "I walked until I couldn't. Until your light." She sank into the chair, her strength draining with the words. "I buried my husband's ring before I left. But when I saw what they'd done, I dug it back up. Couldn't leave it there with them." She touched the silver ring at her throat, the metal dull but clean. "It's all I have left that wasn't taken." Eli didn't answer. He only stirred the fire, the sparks lifting like fireflies before dying in the dark. In the days that followed, a quiet understanding grew between them. Eli did not offer comfort, not in words at least. But he left a cup of coffee at her place each morning, though he knew she still wouldn't drink it. He patched the roof above her room when the thaw began to drip through, and when he noticed her hands trembling one evening as she folded linen, he asked her to help with the horses instead. Work steadied her. He'd seen that kind of grief before. It needed something to hold. Clara began to move differently through the house. Still cautious, but not quite as though she expected to be sent away. She cooked a stew that reminded him of the kind his wife once made, beans and salt pork boiled in coffee for bitterness. The smell filled the small cabin until the walls seemed to breathe again. That night she stood by the doorway, watching the snow melt from the eaves. "I used to think God had turned his face from me," she said quietly. "But maybe he just sent me where I could rest a while." Eli, sitting in the rocking chair, stared into the fire. "Rest don't come easy out here," he murmured. "No," she said. "But peace might." The words lingered, fragile as smoke. He looked at her then, really looked. Not as a burden taken in from the storm, but as a woman carrying her own wreckage with dignity. There was something in her stillness that mirrored his own. The strength of someone who had survived not by hope, but by endurance. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of thawing pine and the promise of rain. The season was turning slowly. Eli rose, set another log on the fire, and poured her a cup of water. "You'll stay," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's eyes softened, not with joy, but with relief. A kind of permission she hadn't dared ask for, and for the first time she smiled. It was faint, fleeting, but enough to remind him that warmth could still exist after the world burned down. That night, as the wind whispered through the chimney and snow melted into the earth, Eli Calder sat in the quiet glow of the hearth and realized something simple yet profound. Compassion didn't need to be spoken, and Clara Vale, lying awake in the small room beyond, understood her own truth at last. Safety did not mean surrender. It meant the freedom to breathe again. By mid-March, the snow began to melt into the thirsty earth. The sound of dripping filled the mornings, steady, persistent, like the slow heartbeat of the land returning to life. Patches of brown grass peeked through the white crust. Streams broke free from their icy stillness, running fast and cold down the gullies. Eli Calder felt the change in his bones before he saw it. Winter had settled deep into his joints, but the thaw brought back purpose, mending fences, clearing fallen limbs, seeing to the horses. Clara followed his rhythm quietly, sweeping the porch, tending the fire, setting seeds to dry by the window. Their days had become measured in small work and smaller words, a piece stitched together by necessity. It was on one of those afternoons, when the air smelled faintly of wet cedar, that a rider appeared at the edge of the valley. Eli was hauling a trough to the barn when the figure crested the rise, tall in the saddle, a long braid glinting dark beneath his hat. Even from a distance, Eli recognized the seat, the posture, calm but alert, a man who knew how to watch the land. "Nalin," Eli murmured, half to himself. The name tasted of old memory and dust. He hadn't seen the Apache in near 10 years, not since the fighting along the borderlands, when peace had been a fragile thing written in blood and smoke. They had once faced one another across a riverbank, rifles raised. Later, when the shooting stopped, they had traded water and silence, each recognizing something human in the other. Now, Nalin rode up slow, his horse slick with sweat and distance. Clara stepped out from the house, her eyes wary, a hand instinctively at her throat where the silver ring hung. Nalin dismounted, nodded once to Eli. "Still breathing," he said, in a voice shaped by wind and years. "Barely," Eli replied. "You look the same." "Older," Nalin corrected, then glanced toward Clara. "You have company now." "This is Clara Vale," Eli said simply. "She's been helping me through the winter." Clara offered a polite nod. though her shoulders stayed tense. She had lived long enough to know how easily peace could shift. Nalin's gaze softened. Not kind, exactly, but respectful. "You chose good ground," he said to Eli. "The hills keep watch. But there's trouble coming from the west. Raiders again, not tribes, not soldiers. Just hungry men with fire in their hands. They burned 2 ranches near the river." Eli's jaw tightened. "How many?" 6, maybe 8. They move fast. Take what they need and leave ashes." Clara's breath caught faintly, but she said nothing. "You'll stay the night," Eli said. It wasn't a question. Nalin nodded once. "Your roof, your rules." The 3 of them ate together that evening. The wind outside was rising, carrying the scent of rain. Eli had built the fire high, the flames painting the walls with amber light. Clara ladled stew into bowls, her hands steady, though her eyes flicked often between the 2 men. The talk was sparse, but not cold. Nalin spoke of his people, those who had stayed near the mountains, living quietly, trading with the towns that once hunted them. "There is peace now," he said. "Not trust, but peace," Eli nodded. "Sometimes that's all a man gets." Clara listened, saying little. Yet in Nalin's calm, measured voice, she heard something she had not expected. Dignity without pride, sorrow without bitterness. It unsettled her in a gentle way. All her life she had been taught that the line between white and red was sharp and absolute. But here, in the flicker of the fire, she saw 2 men who had once aimed rifles at each other now sharing bread. The storm broke before midnight. Thunder rolled across the plains like the growl of something ancient and wounded. Rain hammered the roof, wind screaming down the chimney. The lamp flickered, nearly dying. Eli went to check the barn. Nalin followed, pulling his slicker tight. Clara grabbed a lantern and watched from the doorway, the light trembling in her hand. Inside the barn, the horses stamped nervously. Eli and Nalin moved with the ease of men who didn't need words, securing ropes, tightening the doors, calming the animals. Lightning flashed, white and merciless. "You still keep that rifle by the window?" Nalin asked. Eli gave a small grunt. "Never found reason to put it away." "Good. You might need it." They worked until the rain turned to sheets of water, then stepped back into the barn's quiet. The smell of hay and wet earth filled the air. Eli handed Nalin a rag to dry his hands. "You said they were heading east?" "Toward the valley," Nalin confirmed. "Maybe a week off." Eli's eyes darkened. "Then I'll be ready." "You always were." For a moment they stood facing each other, 2 relics of a time that had tried to bury them both. Then Nalin smiled, faint and weary. "Strange, isn't it? We spent half our lives fighting to draw lines. Now all I want is a place without them." Eli looked toward the rain-swept night. Lines only hold if someone's still trying to cross. When they returned to the house, Clara had lit every candle she could find. The room glowed soft and gold. She took Nalin's wet coat, laying it by the fire to dry, then noticed a tear in the sleeve. "I can fix this," she said. Nalin hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish." She sat near the hearth, needle glinting as she worked. The men talked low behind her, about the spring drives, the cost of feed, the shape of the land after the storms. Their voices carried a quiet rhythm, steady as rain. As she sewed, Clara felt something shift inside her. These men, one scarred by grief, the other by war, shared an understanding deeper than language. Not forgiveness, but recognition. When she finished the mending, she handed Nalin the coat. Their eyes met briefly. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." He slipped it on, testing the stitch. "You sew like someone who's had to start over." "I have," she replied. Nalin's expression softened. "Then you know, the world doesn't end. It just changes hands." By dawn, the storm had passed. The hills were washed clean, shining under the pale gold of early sun. Nalin saddled his horse while Eli tightened the cinch. Clara brought him bread wrapped in cloth and a flask of coffee. He accepted both, nodding his gratitude. "Keep watch," he said to Eli. "The drifters move fast and hunger makes men cruel." Eli extended a hand. "Ride safe." Nalin clasped it, the gesture strong and silent. Then he turned to Clara. "You have good ground here." "Hold it," she nodded. "We will." He smiled once, the kind that carried a lifetime of understanding. then mounted and rode into the mist. When his figure vanished beyond the ridge, Clara turned to Eli. "You knew him once," she said softly. "Long time ago," Eli answered. "And now?" He looked out at the wide, wet horizon. "Now he's a friend." Clara followed his gaze, the morning air cool against her face. Somewhere deep inside she felt the old weight of fear shift, replaced by something steadier. The quiet knowledge that decency could live even in the ruins of history. By the time the sun rose again, Nalin was gone. His tracks led east through the wet pasture, fading into the horizon where the land met the sky like two tired hands pressed together. The morning felt hollow in his absence, the silence heavier than before. The ranch, though unchanged, seemed to hold its breath, boards creaking softer, wind quieter, even the cattle moving slow through the mist. Clara stood by the window, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She had not slept much. The sound of men's voices beneath a leaking roof, the talk of raids and burned homesteads, had stirred something in her chest. Fear and a strange pride. These men had spoken without hatred. She had seen respect in the space between their words. It had been a long time since she'd seen that. Eli moved through the house like habit itself, boots brushing dust, coat thrown over the chair, coffee simmering on the stove. He didn't look at her when he said, "Storm'll break by nightfall." "You best keep the lamps trimmed," she nodded. He didn't ask if she was afraid. He didn't have to. By afternoon, the sky had gone dark and low, pressing against the earth. The first drops came sharp as needles, followed by a sheet of rain that blurred the world beyond the porch. Eli watched the ridgeline, eyes narrowed. He'd seen smoke days ago. He could smell trouble now. That acrid bite of fear you never forget once it's branded in you. Inside, Clara gathered what little comfort she could, patching seams, stoking the fire, keeping her hands busy so her thoughts wouldn't wander back to the ashes of her old life. She could still see her husband's face in the firelight sometimes, not as he'd died but as he'd looked before, proud, kind, and too trusting of people who'd later turn on her. She'd stopped praying long ago, but here, in this lonely house, she sometimes found herself whispering into the wood smoke. Not for forgiveness, just for rest. When Eli came in from the barn, his coat dripping, he paused to watch her. She didn't notice him at first. Her hair had come loose from its braid, silver threads glinting where the light caught. He saw the tired grace in her movements, the quiet dignity she carried even when the world had stripped her of everything else. "You should rest," he said. She looked up, startled, as though pulled from a dream. "And you?" "I'll keep watch." Her eyes lingered on him, not soft, not pleading, just steady. "Then we'll both stay awake." Hours later, when the thunder broke, it rattled the windows and shook dust from the rafters. Eli went to the hearth, checking the rifle above the mantel. He hadn't fired it in years. The metal was clean, but the wood smelled of memory. When he turned, Clara was there, holding a rag and a small tin of oil. She set them down quietly, her hands trembling only a little. "I used to clean my husband's rifle," she said. "He said a weapon's only as steady as the heart behind it." Eli hesitated. "You don't need to—" "I know." Her voice was firm. "But I can." He said nothing, only sat beside her. The rhythm of her work was careful, reverent. The smell of oil and gunmetal mixed with rain. For a long while neither spoke. When she finished, she laid the rifle down between them, barrel pointed toward the floor. The firelight flickered in her eyes, not fear now, but resolve. "I can help if they come," she said softly. Eli's jaw tightened. "No one's coming." "You saw the smoke," she replied. "You've known for days." He looked at her, really looked this time, the bare feet tucked beneath her dress, the small scar along her wrist, the exhaustion that came from too much survival. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Her lips trembled, but her voice did not. "Then let me stay because I choose to." Outside, lightning split the horizon. The sound came seconds later, shaking the air. The horses in the barn whinnied, restless. Eli rose and went to the window. Beyond the rain, he could see shapes moving. Not men, only shadows of wind and branch. But he knew what shadows could become when fear was near. He turned back toward the fire. Clara was sitting in his old rocker, the shawl around her, her eyes closed but her posture alert. A woman waiting for something she'd already endured. He moved to the opposite chair, poured himself coffee gone cold, and listened to the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. It was a sound he used to hate. It reminded him of the night his wife died, of the helpless waiting. But now it filled the room like breath. Neither spoke again until the storm softened to a whisper. When he finally looked up, Clara was still awake. Her gaze met his, not pleading this time, but something quieter. Trust, perhaps, or recognition. Eli felt the weight in his chest shift, the tightness of years loosening, if only a little. He realized then that peace was not the absence of pain, but the sharing of it. Outside, the sky broke open with one last roll of thunder before the world went still. Inside, the fire burned low, and two lonely souls kept watch beneath a roof that had seen too much loss to allow lies. Emotional tone and realization. This chapter carries the ache of unspoken intimacy, a fragile bond forged in silence and storms. Eli and Clara's nearness becomes both comfort and danger. Love here is patient, wordless, and bound by mutual understanding. The thunder outside mirrors the unease within, yet in that stillness afterward, they find a brief, trembling peace. The storm had passed, but the land still held its breath. A pale dawn crept over the hills, laying frost across the fence rails and painting the barn roof in silver light. Eli was already awake, the rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the far ridge where the horizon broke into dust and motion. He'd heard the dogs bark before sunrise, a low warning, steady and certain. Trouble had found them at last. Clara sensed it too. She stood in the kitchen, hands clenched around a tin mug gone cold. Every sound carried sharper than before. The scrape of boots on the porch, the creak of wood shifting beneath wind. She wanted to call out, but fear held her tongue. She had learned in her wandering years that silence sometimes saved more lives than shouting. 3 riders came down the trail. Their coats were tattered, their eyes hungry. Drifters, the kind that roamed burned settlements for scraps of food and mercy, finding little of either. Eli stepped onto the porch before they reached the gate, his rifle low but ready. "Mornin'," the first man said, his grin cut with cruelty. "We're looking for a place to warm our bones. Maybe a bite to eat, maybe a horse or two." Eli's voice was calm, measured. "You won't find welcome here," the man laughed. "Didn't ask for welcome, old-timer." From behind the wall, Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. Through a narrow crack in the doorframe, she saw Eli standing tall, hat brim low, shadow cutting long against the dirt. She remembered the feel of the rifle the night before, the weight of it steadying her hands. Fear was still there, but behind it, something harder, clearer. The second rider dismounted, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Looks like you've got supplies enough for 2, he said, eyes glinting. "Where's your missus?" Eli didn't answer. "She dead?" The man pressed. "Go back the way you came." The silence that followed was thick as rain-soaked wool. Then the first man shifted in the saddle and reached for his holster. The sound that came next split the morning, a single shot, sharp and final. The rider's gun fell before he did. His horse screamed, bolting toward the ridge. Clara had fired through the window. The smoke curled around her face, her breath ragged, her heart a drum in her chest. She didn't remember pulling the trigger. Only Eli's stillness afterward, the stunned quiet that followed the echo. The other men moved fast, one firing wildly toward the house. Eli ducked low, rolling behind the porch beam, his own rifle cracking in reply. The exchange was brutal, short, and left the air smelling of gunpowder and rain. When it was over, 2 men lay dead in the yard. The third had fled into the hills, a dark shape swallowed by distance. Eli stood motionless, the rifle still raised. Clara stepped outside, the cold air biting her skin. Smoke rose from the window's edge where her shot had split the wood. Her hands trembled. She could barely breathe. She began, but the words broke apart in her throat. Eli turned toward her, eyes softening with something that wasn't shock. It was understanding. He reached out, his calloused hand brushing her shoulder. "You did what was right," he said quietly. "You saved my life." She looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time since the night she arrived, she didn't feel like an intruder in this place. She felt seen. Later, when the bodies were laid beneath the hard ground near the fence line, the snow began to fall again, thin at first, then steady, blanketing the churned dirt until the blood disappeared beneath white. Eli worked in silence, digging with the same grim patience he had buried his own family years before. Clara stood beside him, holding the lantern, her breath fogging in the cold. When it was done, he leaned on the shovel, chest heaving, and looked toward the mountains. "They won't be the last," he said. "No," she whispered. "But neither are we." He turned to her then. The wind caught her hair, loosening it from its braid, and the small silver ring tied at her throat caught the light, glinting like the memory of hope itself. For a moment neither spoke. There was nothing to explain, nothing to ask. The world had stripped them bare, and what remained was truth, hard, scarred, but alive. They went inside before nightfall. Eli lit the lamp, the warm glow cutting through the dark. Clara set the rifle back above the hearth, careful and reverent. Her hands were steady now. He poured her coffee, black and bitter. She took it without a word, sitting by the fire where the floorboards creaked softly under her feet. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and iron, of fear burned clean. The fire between them wasn't just flame anymore. It was something earned, something neither could name, but both felt deep as bone. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was low. "You shouldn't have had to do that." Clara's eyes met his. "Neither should you." He almost smiled, a rare, quiet breaking of stone. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Clara watched them rise, vanish, and whispered, "I didn't do it for debt." "I know," he said. And with that, the silence settled again, not heavy this time but whole, the kind that holds a home together when the world outside has forgotten mercy. Emotional tone and realization. The confrontation burns away illusion and fear, leaving only raw truth between them. Clara's courage transforms her from a lost wanderer into a woman of strength and equal standing. Eli in turn sees that love need not be spoken to be real. The fire that once symbolized loss now marks their shared survival, a light that refuses to die. The weeks that followed settled slow as dust after a storm. The land healed first, charred grass giving way to the pale green of new shoots, creek water running clear again through the low gulch. The house stood silent but sound, patched where bullets had splintered the siding. In the mornings, Clara swept the porch clean, her shawl pulled tight against the last edge of winter. Eli mended tools by the fence line, his movements patient, deliberate. They spoke little, but each silence carried meaning now. Not the distance of strangers, but the calm of those who had survived together. Then one afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the far road. Their silhouettes wavered against the sky, long coats, wide hats, the glint of tin stars on their chests. Lawmen. Clara saw them first. She set down the bucket she'd been carrying and called softly, "Eli." He joined her at the porch rail, watching as the horses trotted closer, hooves thudding dull in the damp earth. The men dismounted, nodding a greeting neither warm nor cold. "Morning," said the older one. "We're out of Fort Haven. Got word of trouble out this way. Burned wagons on the North Trail. 3 graves near your fence." Eli wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze steady. "They came here armed," he said simply. "We buried what was left." The younger lawman glanced at Clara, noting the rifle propped just inside the doorway, the faint scar on her wrist. "You fire that gun?" he asked. Her eyes met his without flinching. "I did." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Then I reckon you had reason." The older man sighed, tipping his hat back. "Ain't our place to judge what happens on a man's land when the law is 2 days behind the killing. We'll mark it settled." He looked toward the horizon, where clouds gathered low and gray. "You folks best stay sharp. Times like these, peace don't last long." Eli inclined his head. "Peace never does, but we'll keep it as long as it stays." The lawmen exchanged a look, then swung into their saddles. "Godspeed," the elder said, and they rode off into the empty road, their shapes fading into the pale distance. When they were gone, Clara let out a slow breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "That's the last of it," she murmured. Eli looked at her, his expression unreadable, though his voice carried something gentler than before. Maybe now the land can rest. That night, the wind turned warm for the first time in months. The air smelled faintly of rain and new earth. Eli sat on the porch with his coffee, the chair creaking beneath him. The fire inside glowed low, spilling amber light through the doorway. Clara joined him, her shawl loose now, hair falling in soft waves around her face. They didn't speak for a while. The sound of frogs rose faintly from the creek, and a coyote called from somewhere beyond the ridge. Then, in the hush between those sounds, came the faint rhythm of hoofbeats. Familiar this time, unhurried. Nalin rode up the trail, a sack slung over his shoulder, his horse dark against the starlit fields. Eli stood to greet him. "Didn't figure to see you again so soon," he said. Nalin dismounted, a rare smile ghosting his lips. "I bring gifts," he said. "Seed for spring, corn, beans, things that last, and cloth for her." He nodded toward Clara, who stepped forward shyly, bowing her head in thanks. "These are from your people?" Eli asked. Nalin nodded. "From those who remember the man who once shared his fire instead of his bullets." His tone softened. "You kept your word once, Eli Calder. Now keep her safe." Eli's eyes held his for a long moment. "I will." No more was said. Nalin mounted again, turning his horse toward the moonlit road. Clara watched him go until the night swallowed his shape, the faint rhythm of his horse fading into wind. When she turned back, Eli was still standing by the porch rail, holding the small sack of seed. He weighed it in his hand, then offered it to her. "Reckon you know more about growing things than I do." She smiled, not wide, but real, the first he'd seen from her that wasn't edged with sorrow. "We'll see what the earth allows." Spring came slow but steady. They planted together, row by row, under the pale warmth of a forgiving sun. Clara knelt in the dirt, hands deep in the cool soil, the silver ring around her neck glinting in the light. Eli worked beside her, quiet, his shadow long across the field. Sometimes their hands brushed, small, accidental, but each time it felt like something certain being built. When the last seed was set, Eli carried 2 chairs to the porch, his old rocker, and a new one he'd built from leftover pine. He placed them side by side, facing the open plain. Clara came out with coffee and 2 tin mugs. "You built me a place," she said softly. He looked out over the field, the sun dipping low. "You earned it." They sat as the sky turned to gold, the wind gentle, carrying the scent of soil and wood smoke. A small bird landed on the porch rail, chirping once before flying off again. Clara smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. They didn't speak of marriage nor of vows. Words, they both knew, were too brittle for the kind of truth they'd come to share. The silence between them held all that mattered, the ache of what was lost, and the quiet grace of what remained. As twilight deepened, rain began to fall, soft, steady, warm. Eli leaned back, the chair rocking in rhythm with hers. In the hush of that moment, 2 souls once abandoned found home again, not in promises, but in peace. Emotional tone and realization, peace after hardship. Renewal born of quiet labor and mutual respect. The story closes not with passion, but with the steady rhythm of earned calm. 2 chairs creaking in unison, rain whispering across the roof, and the gentle truth between them. She stayed. Not from desperation, but from choice.